Well, here we are. DM commentary session number 2. And interesting night tonight in terms of the combat that we had, which was the first time in this campaign that we've really had any sort of combat initiated. So we get to explore the system in that regard. And we also had a lot of good political discussion in terms of the fallout from that combat and how that would potentially affect the characters and the people that they've met this time. So overall, I thought it was really good in terms of both the action that we saw and also the choices that the individuals made. Starting off the evening, of course, we had the inevitable choice between leaving the fight and sticking around to see what would happen. We saw our intrepid doctor essentially hang out for a little while until he saw that there was going to be violence, and then he promptly took off with no interest whatsoever, Dr. Quinn, in seeing any sort of combat or fighting, and made no serious attempt to try to warn his friends as well, other than looking at his phone and seeing that, oh, it doesn't work. Well, I guess I'll just leave then. Um, so, yeah, great teamwork in that element, but amongst the other two that were actually in the restaurant when it was attacked, they made some interesting choices as well that definitely had an impact on what occurred. Initially, you saw them just try to leave, and that, of course, resulted in them having their own little quiet combat in the corner as looks like some mortal and a vampire essentially stood between them and an exit. So Vincent benefited from that combat, it would seem, as he got pretty drunk off of feeding from this vampire that he was facing off against in the hallway. Whitey, for what it's worth, did almost nothing in that whole point. He almost did more damage to himself and to his teammate than to any actual enemies. However, it was his first time in combat, presumably. So, hey, you got to start somewhere. But both of them made it out. Both of them split up immediately, went their own ways, which was another interesting choice in terms of both characters just wanting to get the hell away from each other and run in opposite directions. Not exactly a good teamwork moment either, but hey, they're starting out and learning as they go along. I like the initial drama with just trying to reconnect and get blood and figure out how they're going to recover from this whole thing, and the paranoia initially as to whether or not they should avoid Whitey's place or not was also amusing to me as well. But eventually the group made it back home, and they started making phone calls and reaching out to people. And yeah, they definitely saw some of the potential links here as far as the Nosferatu are concerned and how this might impact Tordor and their own relationship with these various factions. Clearly, there seems to be some implication that the Nosferatu or a Nosferatu might have some involvement in this. But we'll have to see how that plays out. They reached out to their own contacts within both the Nosferatu and the Tordor, so good for them for trying to explore and explain what occurred. Also, of course, Mason will hopefully have more details for them as they move forward, but next session, we're going to see some fallout for sure from these events that occurred in the evening. The various phone calls that they made or didn't make. One thing that I find interesting too is that they called Mason, which is good, but they also didn't necessarily call the authorities, the actual sort of 911 for vampires. So that could cast some dispersions on their persuasion as well, or what exactly may or may not have occurred. Their presence there at that meeting could be seen as suspicious in some quarters too. So, we'll have to see how it plays out next session. Whether or not someone got a Diablerie would also be an important thing to consider at this point. Should they show up as having lowered a generation in this, that would, of course, be a non-permitted Diablerie. There was no blood hunt authorized in this whole thing, and they just killed them outright. That would be different in self-defense, then they diablerized him because, hey, you don't really know if it was really a life and death scenario or if this person was hunting somebody. Not really possible to tell if they actually diablerized a Sabbat or some poor, helpless Tordor who was just, working at their restaurant and thought they were having a peaceful meeting. So we'll have to see. Otherwise, like I said, I was pleased with a lot of decisions that the team made, and we'll have to see what the next session brings.